A dreary dawn lazily spread over the river, as if reluctantly painting the sky. The murky water, smelling of algae, lapped sluggishly against the old wooden bridge, where Frank, hunched over, sat on a folding chair. His fishing rod, worn and with peeling paint, was motionless over the water. The fish weren't biting and he didn't really care. Fishing was just an excuse, a reason to get away from people, their voices, their sympathetic looks that cut deeper than a knife. Frank was 62. His face, etched with deep wrinkles like a map of his life, held the traces not just of age, but of the pain that had eaten into him like rust on old metal. He was once a rescue worker, one of those who ran first into fire, into smoke, into screams. He pulled people from under rubble, from cars, from water, and each time he returned home, he felt he had done something real. But 3 years ago, everything changed. He remembered that fire in vivid detail. An old wooden house on the edge of town, as ancient as his own memories. The flames roared like a beast, devouring the walls. Inside was a child, a 5-year-old girl with pigtails just like his granddaughter. He rushed in, but a beam collapsed right in front of him, blocking his path. The screams went silent, and all he could do was see her small hand, lying motionless in the corner. He was too late. For the first time in his life, he was too late. From that day on, Frank left the service saying he was tired, that it was his age, that his back ached. But the truth was different. He couldn't look people in the eye anymore. Every gaze reminded him of that girl, of her mother, whose screams he still heard in his dreams a week later. He stopped talking, stopped laughing, stopped feeling. His wife, Carol, tried to reach him, but even her warm hands and her stews, her quiet words, couldn't break through the wall he had built around himself. Carol died a year ago, quietly in her sleep, leaving him alone in their small apartment that still smelled of her perfume. Now his life revolved around the river. Every morning, he would get up at 5 o'clock, grab his rod and a thermos of tea, and go to the bridge. It was quiet here, only the river whispering something of its own, incomprehensible but soothing. He would sit, watching the bobber, and try not to think about the past, about the girl, about Carol, about how empty he felt inside. Sometimes he caught fish, but he would release them not out of pity, but because he saw no point. Everything leaves anyway. This day promised to be no different. The sky was overcast with gray clouds. The wind chilled his face, making him pull his old jacket tighter. Frank adjusted his cap, rubbed his sore hands, and glanced at the bridge. He loved this place, old and rickety, with paint peeling on the railing. The bridge was like him, tired but still standing. Sometimes a few passers-by would cross, but today it was empty. Just him and the river. He poured tea from his thermos, brought the mug to his lips, but then froze. In the distance on the bridge, a shadow flickered. Frank squinted, trying to make out the figure. A very thin one in a dark hooded sweatshirt, standing by the railing. A teenager, he thought, about 15, no more. A boy or a girl, he couldn't tell from a distance, held a black backpack, clutching it to their chest as if afraid to let go. Frank frowned. Something about this scene was wrong. Neither the place nor the time. He set down the mug and stood up, feeling his knees ache. The wind carried a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, but one that made his heart clench. A meow, thin and pitiful like a cry for help, came from the backpack. Frank froze, staring. The teenager on the bridge also froze, as if listening. Their shoulders trembled, and they squeezed the backpack even tighter, as if saying goodbye to something important. "Hey!" Frank called out, but his voice, hoarse from long silence, was swallowed by the wind. He took a step forward, but at that moment the teen abruptly swung their arm. The heavy black backpack flew down into the river. A splash shattered the silence, and the water closed over it, leaving only ripples and bubbles. Frank didn't think. His body, accustomed to split-second decisions, reacted before his mind did. The fishing rod fell to the ground. His boots were kicked off in a single motion. He rushed to the river, feeling the cold air burn his lungs. Something ignited inside him. Not fire, not anger, but something long forgotten that made his heart beat faster. He couldn't be too late. Not again. The water hit his face like a punch. The cold squeezed his chest, forcing the air from his lungs, but he didn't stop. The river was shallow near the bank but got deeper under the bridge, as dark as his own thoughts. He swam, his arms flailing, feeling the current pulling him down and his wet jeans and sweater becoming heavy like chains. Bubbles rising from where the backpack fell were his only guide. They popped on the surface, small and desperate like last breaths. Frank dived. His eyes stung, the murky water hit everything, but he fumbled with his hands along the bottom, feeling for stones and weeds. His fingers found something soft and slick, the backpack. He grabbed it, pulling it toward him, feeling the fabric resist, snagged between the rocks. His heart pounded, his lungs burned, but he wouldn't let go. Not now, not again. He couldn't let himself lose another life. Surfacing, he took a greedy breath, coughing and choking. The backpack was heavy, water seeping from its seams. Frank swam to the bank, grabbing onto slick rocks to avoid being swept away by the current. On the bank, he collapsed to his knees, shivering from the cold, and placed the backpack in front of him. The zipper was stuck. His fingers, numb from the icy water, barely obeyed him. He yanked harder, the fabric ripped, and finally the backpack opened. Inside were 3 kittens, tiny, wet, with fur plastered to their bodies. 2 were moving, weakly but desperately trying to get out of the puddle at the bottom of the backpack. Their tiny paws slipped, and their faint voices scratched at his heart. The 3rd kitten lay motionless. Its small gray body with spots seemed too little, too fragile. Frank froze. He reached out and touched it. It was cold but still soft. He pressed his finger to its tiny chest, hoping to feel even a weak heartbeat. "Nothing," he whispered, his voice trembling. He didn't know who he was addressing, the kitten, the river, himself. He carefully took the 2 living kittens and held them to his chest, trying to warm them. Their faint warmth, their trembling under his fingers, was the only thing that kept him from screaming. He looked at the 3rd, motionless one, and in his mind, the girl from the burning house flashed. Her hand, her pigtails, her silence. He shook himself, chasing the memories away. He had to act. He got up, holding the kittens, and looked around. The bridge was empty. The teenager who had thrown the backpack had vanished, as if dissolved into the gray air. Frank frowned, feeling something heavy and unjust well up in his chest. Who could do such a thing? Who could throw living creatures into a river like trash? He wanted to feel anger, condemnation, but instead he felt only pain. Pain for the kittens, for the teenager, and for himself. He wrapped the kittens in his jacket, trying not to think about how cold he was. He had to find help. He knew there was a vet clinic a half-hour walk away in town. Carol had once taken their old cat, Baron, there when he got into a fight with the neighbor's dog. Frank took a step forward but stopped. Something white was on the bridge railing, fluttering in the wind. A scrap of paper held down by a stone. He walked over, carefully removed the paper. The handwriting was uneven, childlike, as if written in a hurry. "Mom said, either them or me. Please forgive me." Frank reread the words and his fingers trembled. He looked at the river, at the ripples still spreading where the backpack fell. The teen didn't just throw the kittens, they were forced to. Someone made them make a choice no child should ever have to make. Frank squeezed the paper in his fist, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He knew what a choice was, knew what it was to be too late, but now he had been in time, at least for 2 of them. He looked at the kittens, still shivering in his jacket. One, a black kitten with a white spot on its face, let out a weak meow, as if trying to say it was still holding on. Frank stroked it with his finger, and something inside him stirred, faint but alive like that tiny voice. He turned and walked toward the town, holding the kittens to his chest. The cold bit to the bone. His wet clothes stuck to his body, but he didn't notice. He walked, and each step was like a promise. Not to the kittens, not to the boy, but to himself. He wouldn't let them die. Not today. Frank walked as fast as his squelching, wet boots would allow. The cold cut to the bone, but he didn't feel it. All his attention was focused on the two tiny bodies wrapped in his jacket. The kittens, the black one with a white spot and a ginger one with wet, matted fur, shivered, huddling together. Their faint meows were like a thin thread connecting him to reality. He couldn't let that thread break. The road to town ran along the river, winding between old willows whose branches hung down as if mourning something of their own. Frank didn't look around. His gaze darted between the kittens and the horizon, where the roofs of houses were already visible. He remembered the vet clinic was on the outskirts, in a small building with a peeling sign. He remembered Carol taking Baron there, how she sat in the waiting room stroking the cat, and telling him, Frank, that everything would be all right. Back then he hadn't listened, thinking about his work, about fires, about duty. Now her voice echoed in his head, soft but insistent. Do what you can, Frank. He quickened his pace, feeling his heart pound as if trying to break free from his chest. The kittens were silent, and that scared him more than their weak cries. He carefully pressed the jacket closer, trying to give them some of his warmth. Hold on, little ones, he whispered, not realizing he was speaking aloud. For the first time in years he felt needed. Not just needed, essential. The clinic greeted him with the smell of medicine and a quiet hum of voices. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 50s in a white coat with tired but kind eyes. Seeing Frank, wet and disheveled, with a gray beard and a bundle in his arms, she jumped up. What happened? She asked, coming around the counter. Kittens, Frank breathed, carefully unwrapping his jacket. Someone threw them in the river. 2 are alive. But the third. He didn't finish. The woman, who introduced herself as Linda, was already calling for the doctor. A minute later, a young man with glasses and messy hair ran out of the office. He took the kittens gently, as if they were made of glass, and carried them into the exam room. Frank wanted to follow him, but his legs gave way. He sank into a chair, feeling shivers run through his entire body. Linda brought him a blanket and a mug of hot tea, but he barely noticed her. His gaze was fixed on the door through which the kittens had disappeared. Tell me what happened, Linda said softly, sitting next to him. Frank swallowed, trying to gather his thoughts. He told her about the bridge, the teenager, the backpack, the bubbles in the water, and about the note he still clutched in his pocket. Linda listened without interrupting, only shaking her head when he mentioned the words. Mom said, either them or me. Poor child, she whispered when he finished. And poor little ones. Frank looked at her and saw the same thing in her eyes that he felt himself. A mixture of pain and injustice. He wanted to ask who could do such a thing, but the words were stuck in his throat. Instead, he pulled out the note, smoothed it with trembling fingers, and handed it to Linda. She read it, and her face darkened. This isn't just cruelty, she said quietly. It's despair. Frank nodded. He knew despair. He knew how it ate away at you, leaving only emptiness. He had felt it every day since that fire, since Carol's death. But now, sitting in this small clinic, he felt something else. A weak spark that wouldn't let him give up. The doctor returned half an hour later. His face was serious but not hopeless. We'll probably be able to save 2 of them, he said. They're hypothermic, but their heartbeats are stable. We're warming them up and giving them oxygen. He hesitated, looking at Frank. The third one didn't make it. It was under the water for too long. Frank closed his eyes. He had expected this, but the words still hit him like a stone. He saw the gray kitten with spots before him, its motionless body. Too late again. Again. But the doctor continued. You brought them just in time. A little longer and the others would have been lost, too. You saved them. Frank opened his eyes. Saved. The word sounded so strange, so unfamiliar. He hadn't saved anyone since that fire. He looked at the doctor, then at Linda, and felt something stir in his chest. Not joy, not relief, but something fragile, like the first sprout after a long winter. What will happen to them now? He asked, his voice hoarse but firm. We'll contact some volunteers, Linda replied. There are people who work with little ones like this. They'll nurse them back to health and find them a home. Frank nodded, but another thought swirled in his mind. He couldn't just leave, couldn't abandon these kittens, just as he had abandoned so much in his life. He looked at the door to the exam room, where the two tiny creatures lay, and he knew he had to do more. Can I see them? He asked softly. Linda smiled as if she had expected the question. Come on. She led him to the exam room, where on a table under a warm lamp lay two kittens. They were wrapped in soft towels. Their eyes were still closed and shone faintly under the light. The black one with the white spots stirred, letting out a thin squeak. Frank reached out, touched its tiny paw, and felt his heart clench, not from pain but from something else. From a hope he had long forgotten. Frank sat in the small exam room, his gaze fixed on the two kittens under the warm lamp. Their tiny bodies, still damp but already warm, rose and fell faintly with each breath. The black kitten with the white spot on its face stirred, and its paw twitched as if trying to run from that cold river in its sleep. Frank watched it, and something in his chest tightened. Not pain, not fear, but something alive he hadn't felt in years. He didn't notice that he clenched his fists, as if afraid this feeling would slip away. Linda, the vet tech, quietly entered holding a folder. The volunteers will be here in an hour, she said, sitting beside him. They'll take the kittens to a shelter, where they'll be cared for. We know a woman named Lisa. She's a kind-hearted person who works with these little ones. Frank nodded, but Linda's words sounded distant, like the hum of the river outside the window. He looked at the kittens and thought of the note, of the teenager on the bridge, of their trembling handwriting. Mom said, either them or me. The phrase beat in his head like a bird in a cage. He knew what a choice was. He knew how it tore a heart apart. He had once chosen work, duty, saving others, and it had taken away his time with Carol, her smiles, her warm evenings. And now this teenager, still just a child, was forced to make a choice no one should ever have to make. What about the one who threw them? He asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Linda sighed, her fingers toying with the edge of the folder. We don't know who they are. Maybe from town, maybe from the city. But the note says a lot. They must have been in a difficult situation. Frank pursed his lips. He wanted to find this teenager, look them in the eye, ask why, but deep down he knew they weren't to blame. The adults were. Those who put children in such situations, who forced them to choose between love and survival. He thought of his daughter, Jane, who had moved to the city after Carol's death. She called once a month, said she was busy with work and life. He didn't blame her, but each call left an emptiness in his chest. Maybe this teenager felt the same loneliness that forced them to do something so terrible. He shook off the thoughts. The kittens. He had to think about them. He looked at the ginger one, its face buried in the towel. Its breathing was faint but steady. Frank reached out and touched its back, and the kitten stirred slightly, as if it felt his warmth. Will they make it? He asked without looking at Linda. There's a chance, she replied. They're strong despite everything, but they'll need time. Care, warmth. Lisa knows how to handle these kinds of cases. Frank nodded, but something inside him resisted. He couldn't just give them away, not after he had pulled them from the river, after he held them and felt their faint warmth. He remembered Baron, their old cat, how he loved to sleep on Carol's lap, how he purred when she scratched him behind the ear. After her death, Baron didn't live long. He left quietly, as if he didn't want to stay in an empty house. Frank hadn't cried then, but every time he walked past Baron's food bowl, he felt something inside him break. What if? He began but fell silent, not knowing how to finish. Linda looked at him, her eyes attentive but not pushy. What if what? She asked softly. What if I take them? He blurted out, the words sounding so strange as if they weren't his. I could care for them. My home is quiet and warm. I can handle it. Linda smiled, but there was something sad in her smile. It's not easy, Frank. They're small and weak. You'll need to feed them every few hours, check their temperature, give them medicine. Are you sure? He wasn't sure. He hadn't been sure of anything since the day he lost the girl in the fire, since he lost Carol, since he lost himself. But now, looking at these kittens, he felt he had to try. Not for them, but for himself, for that spark that ignited when he jumped into the river. I can handle it, he said, more firmly than he expected. Just teach me. Linda nodded, and something warm, like the light from the lamp over the kittens, flickered in her eyes. She began to explain how to feed them, how to hold them, how to check their breathing. Frank listened carefully, memorizing every word, every detail. It was like an instruction before a rescue call. Clear, concise, and vital. He didn't notice time passing until a woman with a kind face and tired eyes walked into the clinic. It was Lisa, the volunteer. Are those them? She asked, looking at the kittens. Poor babies. Don't worry, we'll get them on their feet. Frank felt something clench inside. He didn't want them to be taken away. He didn't want to let go of something he had managed to save. He stood up, holding his jacket with the kittens, and looked at Lisa. I'll take them, he said, his voice as firm as it had ever been. They're mine. Lisa looked at him, then at Linda, and something in her gaze changed. She didn't argue or try to persuade him. She just nodded and said, All right, but I'll be in touch. If you need anything, call me anytime. Frank nodded, feeling the heaviness in his chest lighten. He looked at the kittens, at the black one with the white spot, which meowed again, weakly but stubbornly. And in that moment he understood that he hadn't just saved them. He had given himself a chance to save himself. He walked out of the clinic, holding the kittens to his chest. The wind was cold, but it no longer felt so biting. The road home seemed long, but he walked with purpose, as if he knew what he was doing. For the first time in years he did. Frank awoke to a faint rustle. The morning light, gray and soft, filtered through the curtains, painting stripes on the old wooden floor. He had slept on the couch in the same clothes as when he'd returned from the clinic. Next to him, on an old blanket that Carol had once knitted, the two kittens were sleeping. The black one with the white spot, whom he had already named Bridge, was curled into a ball, snuggled against the ginger one. Their breathing was faint but steady, and it soothed him. Frank watched them, afraid to move and disturb their fragile peace. His apartment, small with a worn armchair and a photo of Carol on the shelf, had never felt so alive. The silence here was usually heavy, like the dust settling on books he hadn't opened in years, but now it was filled with tiny sounds. The rustle of paws, the faint creak of the blanket, a quiet purr. Frank reached out and touched Bridge, and without opening its eyes, the kitten nudged his fingers with its face. For the first time in a long time, Frank felt warm. Not from the blanket or the sun, but from something inside. He got up quietly and went to the kitchen. Lisa, the volunteer, had given him everything he needed. Bottles with milk formula, instructions in her neat handwriting, even a small hot water bottle to keep the kittens warm. Frank put water on to boil, remembering her words. Every 3 hours, even at night. Don't miss a feeding. He had nodded then, but only now did he understand what a chore it was. And yet he didn't regret it. For the first time he regretted nothing. When the kittens woke up, he fed them, holding the bottle as carefully as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. Bridge greedily gulped the milk. Its tiny paws pushed against Frank's hand as if afraid the food would disappear. The ginger one was weaker and ate slowly, and Frank waited patiently, whispering, "Come on, little one, you can do it." He didn't know where the words came from, but they flowed on their own, like the river that had almost taken their lives. The days passed slowly but were full. Frank got up at night to check on the kittens, changed their bedding and monitored their breathing. Lisa called every day to check on them and once came with a vet. They praised him, saying the kittens were getting stronger, and that he was doing everything right. Frank just nodded, but inside he felt something new, pride mixed with relief. He had saved them. Not all of them, but these two he had saved. Bridge turned out to be the feistiest. Within a week it was trying to crawl across the blanket, its claws snagging on the fabric. One morning it climbed onto Frank's shoulder, nudged his cheek with its wet nose, and purred loudly like a tiny motor. Frank froze, afraid to spoil the moment. He remembered how Carol used to laugh when Baron climbed onto her lap, how she would say, "He knows I love him." Frank hadn't understood how someone could be so attached to a cat. Now he did. But with this joy came shadows. The note he had found on the bridge haunted him. Mom said, "Either them or me." Frank thought about the teenager, their trembling shoulders, how they stood on the bridge, clutching the backpack. He wanted to find them, to say that the kittens were alive, that it wasn't their fault. But how? The town was small, but faces blurred into a gray mass, and no one knew who the child was. Frank asked his neighbors and the cashier at the grocery store, but everyone just shrugged. One day, with Bridge on his shoulder, he took out the note and smoothed it on the table. The handwriting was uneven and childish, but it held a pain he knew all too well. He remembered the girl from the fire, her mother and her scream. He had been too late then, but now he could change something. He decided he wouldn't stop until he found the teenager. Not to blame them, but to say, "You're not alone." He started going to the bridge every day, no longer with a fishing rod, but with Bridge, whom he carried in an old bag wrapped in a warm towel. The ginger one stayed home, still too weak, but Bridge seemed to sense the river's call. They would sit by the water, and Frank would watch the bridge, hoping to see that figure in the sweatshirt. Sometimes he would talk to Bridge, telling him about Carol, how she loved the river and sang old songs when they walked here together. The kitten listened, or so it seemed, and that was enough. One morning, when the sky was clear and the river glittered in the sun, he saw them. The teenager was on the bridge, still in the same sweatshirt but without the backpack. They were looking at the water. Their shoulders were slumped, and they were gripping the railing so tightly it seemed they were afraid of falling. Frank stood up, feeling his heart beat faster. He didn't know what he would say, but he knew he had to approach. "Hey!" he called out softly so as not to scare them away. The teenager flinched and turned around. Their face was pale, their eyes red, as if they had been crying. "You were here with the backpack, weren't you?" The teenager froze, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "They're alive," Frank said, and his voice trembled. "Two of them. I pulled them out." The teenager's eyes widened. A spark flickered in them. Not joy, but something close to relief. They opened their mouth but said nothing, only swallowed as if the words were stuck in their throat. "I didn't want to," they whispered at last. Mom, she said she'd kick me out if I kept them. I didn't know what to do." Frank felt his chest clench. He stepped closer carefully so as not to startle them. "It's not your fault," he said firmly. "Do you hear me? It's not your fault." The teenager looked at him, and there was so much pain in their eyes that Frank barely held himself back from hugging them. He took Bridge out of the bag and showed him. The kitten meowed, looking at the teen with its round eyes. "This is one of them," Frank said. "I named him Bridge. He's okay. And the other one is, too." The teenager reached out, touched Bridge, and their fingers trembled. "I'm sorry," they whispered, and tears streamed down their cheeks. Frank didn't know what to say. He just stood there holding the kitten, and felt something inside him come back to life. He hadn't just saved the kittens. He had given this teenager hope, letting them know that their actions weren't the end. "Come on," he said at last. "Tell me everything and we'll figure it out." The teen nodded, wiped away their tears with a sleeve, and followed him. They walked down from the bridge, and the river, glittering in the sun, didn't seem so cold anymore. Frank looked at Bridge and the teenager and understood that life had returned. Not loudly, not brightly, but quietly, like a kitten's purr, like the faint light of dawn. He could hear even the weakest voices again.